Ready.
Hello, hello, hello. Okay, so welcome to design practices, best practices for design and mixed reality. This is our roundtable panel. You'll notice that there is one person missing, right? Graham Devine's not going to be able to make it today. You know, like wandering wizards are off to do. He has, fallen into Barad-dûr. But he's going to be back. Don't worry, he'll be back in the sequel. And yeah. The last thing he said was, "Speak, you fools." So let's do it. Okay, so to the right of me are a group of my colleagues. I've been lucky enough to work with them and fight with them and love them for the last 3-4 years. And the interesting thing about them is that they represent perspectives from different parts of the industry, different disciplines. They have their own value systems. And so I think the theory was that we would get out here today and we would talk about some of the important things to us and maybe have some agreement, have a little conflict, a little fisticuffs, and then hopefully share with you some of the best practices or the second best practices that we've learned in mixed reality. Okay, so where do we begin? I'll let you all introduce yourselves first. And while they're introducing, you can actually follow them on Twitter. They all have sort of interesting things to say outside this panel as well. You want to start, Savannah?
Yeah, sure thing. Hey, everybody. I'm Savannah Niles. I've been at Magic Leap for almost 4 years, working really closely with James to lead the UI UX team. James didn't introduce himself, but he's the director of UI UX. I'm a team member. I'm a design lead there, and I also lead Social Suite, a suite of social projects, platforms, experiences on the OS, including Avatar Chat, which we launched today. And we're really excited for you to get to try that in the next few weeks.
Still Jeremy Vanhoozer. So I'm Senior Creative Director of Magic Leap Studios, which is a first-party development group within Magic Leap. I've been at Magic Leap almost 2 years. Before that, I spent most of my time in the game industry. Before that, I was an artist, art director for a whole bunch of things. I worked at Cartoon Network, PopCap, doing Plants vs. Zombies. I started my career at Disney, so kind of coming at it from art and game design angle and working in that realm.
Hi, my name's Aleissia Laidacker. I'm Interaction Director at our San Francisco and Sunnyvale offices in California. Part of what my team focuses on is a lot around characters and the environment and storytelling. So we focus a lot on, one, what does that mean from an experiential side, and then thinking about what are the tools that we want to develop so that we can empower creators to think about how to actually maximize and take use of the environment, because that is really the power of mixed reality, is we have all of this user and environmental information, and we want to make sure that creators are using that in the best of their capabilities. Before that, I worked at Ubisoft, as did you, and I was gameplay and AI lead on most of the Assassin's Creed games.
Hi, I'm James Everett. I'm a producer and lead game designer with the team in Wellington, New Zealand, the Dr. Grobort's Invaders team. So we're a collaboration between Weta Workshop and Magic Leap. I've been with Magic Leap, I guess, about 3.5 years now, which seems like forever. And we just launched Invaders yesterday, which has been a lot of fun. If you've come down to play the demo, thanks very much. I hope you had a good time. The space is really quite incredible. The team outdid themselves. Likewise, I'm also coming from the game industry for a long time now. And it has been very exciting to be in the middle of something this new and this weird.
Hi, I'm Brian. I run a team called the Interaction Lab at Magic Leap. It's a rapid prototyping group. We do a lot of experience exploration. We try and feed all that back in so that the systems can get better and get more attuned to the types of experiences that we want to make in mixed reality. And that's about it. And so like it's a big chore. We've probably made several hundred prototypes over the last 4+ years. And we've found a lot of stuff. And so now we're actually putting it out as some short little MR moments with full source code in Unreal and Unity so that you can play around with it and really get your head wrapped around some of these things and figure out some of these more advanced interactions in space.
Okay, cool. So we've got about 5 questions. Maybe we move through them quick enough and we can ask y'all some questions too. So the first one I'd like to ask everybody, if you could share a little bit, and maybe I'll I'll start it off. But how did you decide to move to mixed reality? You know what I mean? All doing design in like conventional mediums, and then what kind of drew you to Magic Leap in particular? So yeah, I'll start off and just say that like my background was in the arts. I'd never worked in consumer electronics before, and I did this project with a colleague of mine named Tony and a bunch of friends, and he was an artist and great graffiti artist, and at some point in early 2000s, he was diagnosed with ALS. So eventually he lost control of his body. You know, he couldn't move at all, fully locked in, but he was like completely alive in his brain. And so we made a device for him that was like a cheap pair of sunglasses from Venice Beach Boardwalk and a PS3 iCam, and it ended up being like a $40 version of like his $15,000 Toby system. And when I saw, you know, him draw using his eyes, you know, it was like he said, it was like being underwater for 5 minutes and coming up and taking a breath. And I thought there's something really powerful about bringing the computer like closer to your skin, you know, like in closer contact to your body. So that drew me to work at Samsung, and I made a bunch of face computers there that no one, you know, sort of paid any attention to, and then, you know, got drawn to Magic Leap because, well, because Roni walked out in that like spacesuit, and you know, like the other founders were in Shaggle costumes, and I'm like, this is an interesting place to do something no one's ever done before. So that was me. Savannah, I know a little bit about you. Do you want to tell these folks why you came to Magic Leap?
Yeah, I have sort of an abridged answer. It's really simple. This is like an inevitable interface. What else, if you're a designer, like you're just eventually going to be designing in this space. Like we're either there or we're going to be there.
I think for me, it's very rare that you get to do something completely new. You know, working in games, I'm talking loud. Working in games as long as I have, and then before that, even just in art, it's very, usually you're following to do something else on a platform. And so I think with Magic Leap, I'm really sorry. With Magic Leap, it's all new. I mean, every day there are different questions that I've not asked before, which I think is compelling. And I think, you know, to what Savannah said, I think you start seeing where we're headed, and you start seeing the opportunities that present themselves in this new platform, and it is kind of inevitable. And so for me, yeah, it's very rare that you get to open a door that is completely new. So I think that fascinated me to a point enough to move to Florida.
To the swamp.
Pretty convincing then.
Yeah.
My reason why I joined is actually because of most of the people on this panel. It was 2 years ago. I was speaking at a conference in Australia. And whenever I give conference talks, I rant a lot. I'm known as being the ranter. So, and I was ranting about how in video games, there's such an emphasis on making open world systemic games. And what that means is that the game and the system is able to understand what the user is doing and can adapt and make games that are smart. But with this amazing system, people were still making the same shit over and over, where it's shooting games and you're killing people. And I was ranting, going, what the hell is the point of making these amazing systems when you're making the same types of games? So you were there, and you're like, let me tell you about Magic Leap. And then 3 months later, after we had started those conversations, I was at another talk, and I was ranting again, saying how AI has not changed in probably 15 years. And I was like, what the hell? There's so much that we can do with AI, but why is it that characters are always these kind of like non-moving killing targets? And I was like, why can't we start thinking about doing something interesting with AI? And then Brian Schwab came up to me and was like, so can we still keep talking about Magic Leap? And while I was trying to make my decision, I had watched a video from Graham Devine where he gave this fabulous talk about the possibility space of mixed reality. And I started crying my eyes out because I'm this big emo person, and that's when I called them. I went, fine, guys, I'm going to join Magic Leap.
Yeah, pretty similar story, I think, is that there are very few times in your life where you get an opportunity to jump into something with both feet that is genuinely new and different. And as a game designer, I've been very fortunate to work in some very interesting stuff and some very basic stuff, we'll say. And so this opportunity to play into a whole new area, I couldn't really say no. On top of that, I'd had five winters in Toronto, and I was pretty ready for not 5 more winters in Toronto. And so very enjoy being in New Zealand a lot. So yeah, it's been quite a ride.
So for me, I finished a game in California. I was living here, and when the game was done, I remember the specific day. I walked down the hall, and we had literally just pushed the button to shove. It was an online game, and we pushed it out to the world. And like this gal came around from the other direction, and she was like, "Woo!" And I was like, "Woo!" And then she was like, aren't you more excited? You just released your game." And I was like, well, I'm excited, but you know, it's my 19th game. And she was like, "Oh man." And she goes, "Well, you should still be excited." And like going away from that experience, I thought to myself, you know what? I should be more excited. I think I've gotten a little bit too comfortable and a little bit too good at this. And like the fact that I can make a game that like just literally went out to 19 countries and not be super excited about the fact that millions of people are happy tells me that maybe I need to grow as a human. And that maybe I need to push myself harder than I have been pushing myself. And so I left. I tried a little bit of a startup on my own for a while. That went the way that most startups go. And in the meantime, I had been talking with the Magic Leap folks and got to join very early on. And part of the reason that I joined is because I took a demo, and then I went home, and I very specifically tried to think to myself, okay, let's try and think of some applications. And like after about 7 million, in the first hour, I thought to myself, okay, this is crazy that I don't join this. Like this is a revolutionary new thing. And it's taken us 30 years to really go from 2D to 3D. To really master 3D in our medium, it's taken us about 30 years. I don't want to know how long it's going to take us to master mixed reality. It's probably the last big push until I'm dead. And so, which is another 20 years. No, so anyways, so for me, like it wasn't a big choice. It was more like I had to go here because it was a growth moment, and it was also the thing that I knew that we were heading towards, and it's a huge space. So.
I'm glad you all did it. So last night I went to a party, a bunch of developers, and I pretty much got a full-on like mob with the pitchforks and torches treatment about a feature on this product that they thought was like a spectacular failure. So, I mean, I'd love to ask you all about a spectacular failure that you've had, released in this product that you think people might be interested in learning from.
Yeah. So that's a great question. And I love the idea that we're going to open up the best practices of design with our worst practices in design. Okay, so yeah, the less practices, shall we say. Okay, so question is spectacular failure of design. And I have an anecdote, and James wanted me to tell it, and Graham also approved it, and so hopefully I don't get into trouble for it. Okay, so back 4 years ago, James and I were working on speccing, designing the interactions on the hardware for the device. That's kind of where we started, and at the time it was, you guys are in the field. You remember 4 years ago, this was a bit newer, and like the limitations of the platforms that we kind of have now to work on were still pretty unknown. They were sort of theoretical. We were sort of, there was a lot of sci-fi in our kind of aspirations, and you all remember being here. The feeling at the company was so ambitious. It was so optimistic about the future of spatial computing and wearable computing that we started designing this hardware, really imagining a product that you would wear all day, and that would replace your phone. And so the first feature we designed for it was this thing called the reality button, which it was supposed to be at the temple of your glasses, and the idea was really cool. It still is unquestionably cool that you'd be wearing these like super sick, spatial computing headset, and that you could just, when you wanted to kind of go back to reality, so to speak, just be human again, you could just like reach up and tap your temple, and the audio would mute and the visuals would dim. And so this is the first thing we spec'd. It was like the oldest spec. We didn't like change a word of it, but then as like the product kind of evolved, and it got moved from the headset down to the power pack or the lightwear, and you know, the industrial design kind of changed, and the sort of ability to find the button and locate it and click it sort of was different than we thought about, and just the use case sort of changed, but the feature always stayed, because it's hard to kind of take you know, it's hard to change a hardware feature. That's an aspect of hardware design that is really challenging, is that you have to start years in advance and make some educated guesses before you can get it into the hands of users or really think about it in the context of your real use case. And so this button was there, and we were kind of like stuck with it. And then we, you know, the software sort of functionality for it came online fairly late, and the week it was turned on, like when you click the button, everything, like reality would sort of commence, like audio would mute and the visuals would go away. Everyone, there was like an uproar in the office with like QA. They're like, we just kept getting pinged, like, hey, we found this bug. When you click this button, like everything stops. And we're like, no, that's a feature, it's not a bug. It was like, we took so much crap for this continuously, but I find it like a really, like almost poetic aspect of this product, because to me it's like a bit of like an appendix, like this feature of this vision that Magic Leap had from the start, of like just a paradigm shift in the way we sort of interact with computers, the relationship we have with our devices, and our sort of human-centered approach, you know, from the beginning. But I recognize some people find it a little easy to push on accident and kind of unexplained. So I think we might call it a failure, but I think there's some context there that speaks to our kind of techno-optimism as a team here.
I had just one quick one, actually, which was, I find that it was somewhat of a fail to call anything a best practice too soon. Like it's such a huge space of possibility, and there's so many times when we would find something, we would share it with our friends, like, have you tried this? And then a week later, we would just completely blast it into oblivion by finding something so much better. That, like, I've actually started to call, like, stop using the phrase best practices. It's more like best known or best current, because it's just such a huge space, and there's so much good stuff to find. And like, you end up finding stuff that then gets you to the place you need to mentally think about to then make the next best thing to do. And we've grown in every direction in that way, and completely discarded so many best practices in just a few years that, like, I almost call that a fail to call anything a best practice.
We're going to rename this talk when it goes online. It's not the best practices of design.
Second best practices.
Yeah.
They're good. You might use them. You could. I don't know.
Yeah, I also think, speaking to that, I think it's, I don't have a reality button story, but I think, you know, so I've worked on the Create project for the last year and a half, and I think there were a lot of failures, you know, and I think that's good. It's kind of speaking to what Brian's saying. I think specifically with developing for Magic Leap, like, get in quickly, mess it up, break it, and then move on. And so I think there's a lot of stories about something we thought one week was like the thing, you know, and you quickly realize through just even basic testing, wow, mixed reality and spatial computing are totally different. So we're going to have to think about it differently. So, I mean, I think for my part and my team, there are so many failures, but I almost see that as a good thing. I think if we were up here saying, I don't know, I can't think of anything, I think one, we'd be lying, but I think that would be bad. So I think there's a lot of failures, and I think we could do a whole talk on probably where you stepped into it. But I think that's good. I think it's good for us to fail. Yeah.
I would maybe say one of the failures has been anyone that comes to start working on our platform and limiting themselves to just what our SDK is exposing, I would say is a big design flaw. And one of the things that our team works on in San Francisco is actually seeing how you could interface with all different types of middlewares and third-party APIs. There was a talk earlier today from Aleissia Laidacker where he was talking about how we're interfacing with, like, LED strips and microcontrollers and Philips Hue lights and everything that's IoT. So I think from a design side, if you just think, well, here's like the Magic Leap SDK and that's what mixed reality is, it isn't. This is just a package to get you to start working on the platform, but we really want designers to think about the possibility space of anything that you can interact with.
Yeah, it's really, there's a lot of thinking that just doesn't work anymore. You know, it's been making games for quite a long time, and there's a lot of assumptions that we have, whether that's input standards, right? Like it took us a long time to settle in on the two analog sticks, and particularly when it comes to certain styles of action games, for example, movement on the left, look on the right. And those are all standards that are layers of abstraction for you to interface with a 2D screen. And every time in Invaders, when we tried to do something where we abstracted away from physically interacting with stuff, it just didn't work out. So most of our interactions are really about doing things that seems like, oh, that's quite a few steps. And it's like, yeah, but we know that you know where you are in any given point of the flow. One of the things that we actually ended up removing was a physicalized aspect of the ray guns, where we had dispensers that you could place on the floor and it would pop up, and that's how you actually got different types of like shot in your ray gun as you'd walk over to this thing. Downside to that is that we don't know very much about your space, because your space is completely different from your space, is completely different from your spaces. Everyone's space is so different. So if we're taking up valuable real estate in your home or office or whatever by saying these are things that you have to put down, and then the robots have to navigate around those, and then you've got to navigate around your furniture to get to those, and it's like, nah, we're just going to simplify everything right back to saying the tool is in your hand, and we will do our best to create like excitement around you. And so almost everything in Dr. Gorbort's is a dynamic system that is designed to do its best to make your space as fun for you as it can be, regardless of the space.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, thank you all for that. But you guys seem like you kind of all agree on a lot of stuff. So I want to ask like a question that I know you don't agree on, you know? I like to ask about input. I think you think input should be embodied, right? And that transmodality and these blended interfaces is sort of the future. You know, Create has this interface that's like a pointer, you know, sort of similar to like the VR paradigms that are out there right now. And you've been pushing this touch interface for years, right? Which one of you are right and which one of you are wrong? Also, and I think you probably just want like 16 more buttons, right?
Couple more buttons.
I actually super disagree, because you give more buttons and people are gonna fall back to the like game controller shit, where like all of our inputs are supernatural and accessible. So I fought so many times when people are like, add more buttons to the control. I'm like, no.
It's working, James.
Well, except I'm gonna turn around and agree, because one of the very first rules that we had was 2 buttons, and one of them is the trigger, and the other one has to be the shield button. Although we use gesture for shield in the game, and the other button became the way that you selected between ray guns, because we got rid of the dispensers. But yes, no, I think more buttons is not necessarily better buttons. There's a million things you can do.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
The reason why I think people really like buttons on our device is because if you can sort of map an interaction to buttons on our controller, you don't have to put visible UI in the scene, which is like hard. You know, every pixel you kind of draw to the field of view of the user is like a pixel you take away from the real world. So in a UI, you typically have this like great rule of thumb when you're designing a mobile app or, you know, a 2D app that's like recognition over recall. Like show them something versus, you know, allow them to kind of or force users to remember modes and like modal interactions. And in MR, we sort of have like almost the desire for the opposite. Like we want to keep the display clear. We want to preserve the integrity of the real world. So buttons are a great way to have kind of recall over recognition in some ways in MR. I think that's why we all kind of fight for buttons. I mean, we were the ones who were like kind of from early days were like, no buttons, like buttons are ugly, and now we're like also fighting in our own team over buttons in the OS. Anyways, what were you going to say?
No, I was just going to say, I think it's not good for the fighting aspect of this panel, but I think that you know, Create specifically, we went with the control, but I think it's very experience specific. I think we recognized early that Create was a first touch point for so many people, and I think, you know, we kind of balanced that recognizability of input versus trying to do something completely new. We tried a lot of things, and I don't think you would get any argument from our team that there are things we could do better, and there are things we could do different. But I also think that, you know, we tried the control plus gesture, which actually was super cool. But because of how we put the design together, we had a lot of people who didn't have a lot of experience with the device throwing up gestures by accident and really kind of sending them off into a path that took them to a place they didn't know how to get out of. And so for the specific experience, we kept everything very, very simple. Actually, Javier, who's sitting right there in the audience, is on my design team, and he focused on UI and UX and inputs. And every single day we would talk about this. And I think we had like a pile of things that were really cool and we wanted to do going forward, and then a pile of things we kept very clean for focusing on the control for the create experience. However, I'm not going to sit and argue that it's the best control. I think for that specific time and for the 1.0 of create, I think that's where we want it to go. So it doesn't help to fight, but I think there's many different types of inputs that work.
Brian, I mean, what do you think we lose if we treat mixed reality interfaces the same way we do our touch devices? You know, use the simplest, lowest muscle innervation interactions.
I think that for certain applications and for certain tools, you want to use those tools in a consistent manner. But the awesome thing about our device, it has so many inputs that are not an abstraction. They're actually your hand or your voice or your eyes or where your head is or where I'm standing. And those don't need to be abstracted in that case, right? Like if you're using a control or the phone or whatever, then yes, I think it makes sense to stick to sort of more standardized, more clear ways of using the tool in a way in which people would understand. But I would hesitate to do the same to the hand or eye gaze, you know what I mean? And so for me, like when you start to get out into the types of experiences that use those more embodied things, then to me, then what you're wanting to do is to be true and respect those inputs for the ways in which people already use them and the ways in which people will naturally use them so that you can get an accessibility that you maybe can't have out there. Like we've had a number of people come up to us and be like, I'm really happy that you guys are doing a number of things, like I can use the control, I could potentially use gestures, or I could even just wave my arm around, you know what I mean, for particular applications. Because like I have limited mobility in this hand, it'd be great that now I can do it anyway. Or I can use a controller, but like not for very long because it just doesn't work with my particular physiology. But like I love voice commands and like getting people some of these more natural things that back up the human system, right? Allow people that maybe have deficiencies in various areas to now suddenly still be accessible into the real world, that a completely abstracted situation is hard-pressed to do.
Yeah, when we communicate and interact with each other and things, we're like naturally redundant. Like we look at people, we're communicating with like our eyes and our expressions, and we're using our hands to gesture, and we're saying stuff. And I think a natural interaction model, like Brian, just like you're saying, is also naturally redundant. Like different contexts, you're going to use different inputs, different abilities, different moods, and recognizing too that like your body language and your voice and your hands and everything, when kind of interacting with the system, they're going to sort of synergistically be indicating intent. And that's something that like our device is pretty uniquely capable of. That's like a super rich, I think, area to mine when designing interactions for games or applications.
Maybe just one last thought on that is that how do we bridge when you're in an interface and you swipe around, maybe you point and you grab and drop things, and then suddenly you click into an app and it doesn't need the controller, you know? How do we transition people into those new experiences? I mean, what do we do with all the baggage of that? The notifications that come in that say, your controller's gone to sleep, and then they have to find it and pick it up and click it. I don't know. Is there a way? I
think for now, like today we're in the early stages, right, of creating mixed reality. And right now it is each developer that is programming their experience around my pickup is with the control. Whereas someone else's experience, a pickup might happen with a series of gestures. And I think it's normal because people are getting used to like using it. And again, it's because they're using what is exposed in the SDK today. But what I want to see, and I think this is something that we've discussed that we want to start like investing in, is how can we create interaction models that are much more about the humanistic side, where it's not have I pressed a button or have I done a gesture, but where it actually is where the creator says, when I pick up or when I tap, or when I push, and then we can have a model underneath that actually sees yes, the user has a control in their hand. So let's use the control as that input to satisfy that action. Or let's say someone does have a disability of some type, we're not going to use the control, we're not going to use gestures, and we rely back to just using maybe eye tracking. And I think that that's going to be a way so that every experience that's being programmed and developed can be accessible for anyone, and also in any place. Like Vuha, actually, when he was giving a talk earlier today, he was saying maybe it's not just about disabilities, but maybe I want to play Create where I'm cooking, but I can't use my hands, but I really want to like have my dinosaur spawn and like jump over this stove while I'm cooking, but I can't use my hands. But if the system was able to still use all the interactions and know, you know what, we are just going to use eye tracking and head pose, I would love to see that.
Yeah. I think also, you know, accessibility is such a big thing that I think we're still new at this, you know, and I think we have to, I mean, kind of calling ourselves out, we have to get better at anticipating everything you just described. I think the expectation, I mean, we talk a lot about the expectation of the device. We're in very early days, and we know the restrictions, we know the realities. The expectation from you guys and from everyone is pretty crazy. I mean, it does everything, right? It's human-centered. But when we think about that and we think about actually building that, it's hard. It's going to take investment. It's going to take patience. But what you describe is something that reacts and adjusts to you, which I think is the expectation going forward. I don't think it's going to be something special that Magic Leap does. I think it's what is going to be expected. And so when you think about accessibility, I don't want to have to get in and explain all of my limitations. I mean, to me, the ultimate would be, don't worry, like we're covering the bases. So if there's things we can detect, there's things that we can get better at. So we're a long way from that, but I think, I mean, I think that we should hold ourselves to that standard. I mean, we're supposed to be setting that tone. I mean, we do talk a big game, and I think we have every intention of doing that. I think we have to recognize we're in the first days, but to me, you know, we talk a lot about the expectations that are to come, and we as designers have to meet those expectations. To me, accessibility and having the device really kind of match your intent and your ability is something that I think has to be built as the underpinning to everything that we do. So that's a big thing. And we're not quite there yet, but I would say that we have to get much more flexible in how we handle that.
That's actually the beauty of the device. Yes, it is a mobile display, but it is also a collection of sensors that are on you that allow the device to have a much greater perception of you as a human, as a person with intent and behavior and all that you want to do. And the awesome thing is, like, you've probably heard a lot over the last day about like getting your experiences to work in any environment, basically, so that like the device isn't just personally accessible, but the experience is actually accessible in any environment. But it's also the other direction, right? It's like you not only want the device to work in any environment, we have to work just as hard to get the device to work with any person.
I would sort of, going back to your original question, what's the best input? Sort of related to that, I think I'm going to just take a stab. I think the best input, which none of us have found, would be one that like layers and harmonizes ballistic targeting and ballistic interactions, like imprecise interactions with precise interactions. And like we can take the OS, which I think you've all experienced, as like a case study in that. We use a touch interaction model in the OS for two reasons. One is that, you know, the OS is kind of like an operating system, nothing can go wrong, and EM tracking, one of like the most amazing engineering feats that this company has kind of accomplished, was a little late to the party, you know? And so we haven't yet sort of plumbed it all the way through and integrated it into the OS. So a pointer interaction model wasn't really ever an option for us because we weren't sure when this was going to get out the gate. We weren't sure if our 6-off was going to be ready at the time. We had to have like a fail-safe, and touch is like theoretically a known technology. In reality, touch is actually really hard it's really difficult to make a refined touch experience, which we took for granted because we, you know, live every day with like sort of sublime touch experiences in our smartphones. But these are like the products of 10 years of like hardcore engineering and hardcore interaction design. So we use this touch interaction model, but another advantage of it is that it's possible to like really precisely target small things, and we wanted to make kind of a clean, modern interface that prioritize keeping your display really, really clear and trying to free up our apps and experiences with as little UI as possible, sometimes maybe even to the detriment of usability. We had to kind of add bigger and more UI later in the game. But our vision was something really minimal, really clean, really easy to use and foundational with this touch interaction model. And what we're working on now, as Jared kind of alluded to in the keynote, is now layering on more ballistic pointer interactions with your head, which is one type of target, and your eyes, which is another sort of set of like dogs on a leash to sort of play with that type of targeting, and then the pointer too, because just like frankly speaking, point interactions at things that are small and far away are difficult to use. So like the browser, for example, we really struggle to use it with a pointer when it's at like a legible distance. So I think that that's like in terms of the best input in sort of with the current technology, with the current display technology, as I've seen it play out in the OS and the constraints of like small, really sort of clean, minimal UI that the OS really needs to look modern. It really comes down to that, like balancing these really natural, proprioceptive, ballistic interactions with the needed precision just to navigate with tiny little UI.
Okay, well, cool. Okay, so we all have probably one or two things that we think are like critical pieces of information that developers should know. And if we could just sort of like concisely, quickly share some of that. Maybe one thing I'd love to share with y'all is some thoughts about comfort and designing for comfort. The first one is that like you must design for physiological comfort. A great example of this is text. Most of the developers I see are using text that's too small. It may be legible, but it's not readable. I mean, I see some of your work, it's not that way, but including in our operating system, we had to change our type hierarchy because we did some tests, and they show very clearly from 20 to 25 pixels, so it's at 1.5 meters away from you, a letter should be about 18 centimeters tall, millimeters tall, or you won't be able to read it. And well, you may be able to read it, but it'll cause a headache, right? And so our industry is impacted by those headaches. Like that nausea is one of the biggest deterrents from people buying our products, right? So make your text big enough. It sucks because you don't want to cramp your interface, but it's the best practice.
On that note, actually, Roni had a really good intuition about this before we even did, and he always used to tell us, he's like, listen, go to the mall. Look at the signs outside the stores in the mall. Make the interface look like that. And we were like, stop it, please stop. We can't hear that. We want beautiful little interfaces.
Another aspect of comfort that I think is really important is like cognitive comfort. And I think cognitive comfort, there's a bunch of different ways to think about that. And Brian, you've taught me a lot about this. But like, cognitively, people are challenged when they use the interface and they go bleep, 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 plank, and then your interface is like the same thing. It's a radial menu, but now you're spinning it with a 6-DoF controller. Their flight path, they took off at one airport and they landed at another. They've done it over and over again, and then suddenly they take off and they just go straight up to outer space. It could be a better experience, but it's still cognitively unnerving. So use the trigger to select things. Use the trigger to activate things. Use the bumper button to bring up context. You can throw a grenade with it too. I mean, no one's going to stop you from throwing a grenade.
Contextual grenade.
Yeah, but if no one said hit the bumper, swipe over to the grenade, click the grenade, you don't need to do that. But if you have a context menu and you're bringing it up by triple tapping the home button, that's a TRC. We would say, please don't. Like, go back, come back, make a little change, and we'll pass it. Another thing is the home button. The home button right now, there's a TRC that says when you tap the home button, use it to go back through the hierarchy. So you tap the trigger, you go in. You tap the button, you go back out. This is similar to like iPhone's approach as well. So use that home button as a way to navigate, like you were saying. You can remember that happens, and you can remove another piece of UI from people's, it's a sort of occlude reality. Currently Create is not passing that TRC.
Sorry about that.
So use the home button also when you tap it at the top of your hierarchy to pull yourself to a pause menu within your immersive application. This is something that works. It works great in the App Store. Very consistent behavior that people enjoy all across the rest of the core apps. So then the last one I think is like, design also for social comfort. Like there's not a lot of social comfort required in designing for a laptop, right? Because most of this is happening privately. But if your interface, like the Kinect, is like to do the cactus pose, no one's going to do that in public around their friends. It's something that they would do in private, but it's going to prevent people from feeling sort of comfortable about themselves. If you make a product that you don't look sexy in, people probably aren't going to buy it. So mission accomplished on that one. And then another great social best practice is build privacy into your application by design. So require people to opt into your platform's collection of their data. Don't just put the button on yes and hope that their sort of the inertia of interface clicking will just take them right through to the next level. But ask them first. It introduces friction. I hate it. I've fought against legal on a lot of these subjects, but I think at the end of the day they're right. So those are the three things that seem like they're important things to me around comfort. I don't know. Do you all have some kind of tidbits?
Talk about something very different on the developer things to think about, and we actually haven't talked about one of our most powerful features on Magic Leap, and that's spatialized audio. And I think anyone who's developed games or experiences before have probably all seen that pitfall where people start thinking about audio, UI, and effects at the end of your product. And in mixed reality, you're going to get screwed if you do that. Actually, we always suggest to people, start thinking about spatialized audio, UI, and effects right from the beginning. If anything, prototype using those three features even before you start doing interactions and experience stuff. And the reason for that is because those three features are so key to getting the user's attention in a space, and we're now making experiences for a full 360 world around us. It's no longer just on a screen. And those are three elements that are really going to help the user get guided in their experience. And you can actually use that as almost a walkthrough of your whole experience and see, with those three elements, are you guiding the user to where you want them to be or not? And if you don't think about using those three right from the beginning, then it's really going to be a fail in terms of how your experiences are going to come out at the end.
I would say that for me, the number one sort of rule that I would give people is just to start building stuff now. Because there is such a dearth of knowledge that you need to have to really build compelling mixed reality stuff. And the best way to do it is to just build stuff. And go ahead, build it exactly the way you think it should be built right now, and find out how it fails. And only by building stuff can you really start to really get this space, because it's very different. We're used to making these immersive experiences where we pull the user in and we show them how wonderful that world is, and we show them how respectful all the internal rules of that world are. And now what we want to do is bring stuff out into your world and be respectful of you in your world. And it's a very different thing to design for. It's a very different experience world to try and build when you're saying, I've jokingly said a few times, if I sit and watch a television show of a character and he's screaming his head off, I can find massive entertainment in that, you know what I mean? And just kind of passively watch it. But if that same guy is in my kitchen, yelling at me, I'm whoa, this is whoa, and you really, it's a different world when the content is living with you in the world, in the real world. And making it compelling is not about building bigger and more epic things. It's about showing deeper and deeper respect for the real world so that people can maintain their reality cues and they can understand that this thing you've given them is in the real world. It's actually in the real world, because that's what makes it magical. And it's very different, and it's very hard to get there if you haven't built a lot of things so that you can really get your nose around that sense, that very different way of thinking.
I think for me, a couple things. One, keep it simple, stupid is a real thing, especially in the early days of what we're doing. I think there's always an impulse to put as much as you can on screen or on device, and I think that gets really confusing and loud. I also think, for us as a team, it's really important to understand that these are the early days, and even TRCs and best practices, as I think we've said before, that's a really dangerous term, and I think we should be really open to you guys and everything you're doing, because I mean, we've learned so much even just from the creator launch, seeing how people engage. And I know James wants to pick a fight, so this is a good one. In the early days, you know, as you mentioned, you know, Create's not in compliance, but I think one of the things that we found is that the best practices were really early, and they didn't really work for Create. And I think that, you know, a lot of back and forth was had, and, you know, there were some input arguments. And, you know, some buttons that were kind of called out at a system level did not work for what we were doing, and were actually very confusing. So that difference that you see between, that James is talking about, for, okay, you might be at a system level, and then you might get into an experience that has decided that this is a much more comfortable way to interact with this type of content. So I think we're going to see that from you, and I think we need to be receptive to that, because I think best practices are what keeps the foundation solid, but also you need to grow from that. And we are in like 0.05 day of mixed reality and spatial computing. So I do think there's something interesting where I think we lay a foundation, and that is our job. But I think then we need to be smart enough to grow and adapt and find that best practices will probably evolve like crazy over the next few years. So I think that's a big deal. And I think we also need to be open as a team, because those moments are going to happen. And I think if we sit up here and we could lie, but I think there are challenges within Magic Leap that I think will make us stronger. And so I think that's a big deal.
I'd say just one thing as a tip, or even a best practice, or whatever you want to call it, is get away from your computer. You're going to have to build your experiences using your computer, right? You've got Unity or Unreal, you've got Maya, Visual Studio, everything's there. That's where you're going to be doing the hard yards of making this thing happen. But actually imagining your experience, thinking it through, you need to stand up and get away from your desk, because that's not where you're going to have that experience. Unless you're building something that's intended to be seated, cool. But by and large, you're moving around. One of the most effective things that we did when we were prototyping Gimbal, like our AI companion, was we did a bit of improv theater. We had a little cutout of Gimbal, and we had a cutout of Dr. G, and Jordan was Gimbal, and I think Greg was Dr. G, and then Greg wasn't, because he wanted to make sure that he knew how these two characters would interact, so he could stand back and say, Jimmy, step over there, and like, you know, and we were able to stand there and go, oh yeah, because these are people. They're in my space. It feels really weird if they're in my space. It feels better if they're in my space. So, you know, it's worth stepping back from your tools and going, how are we in the world? And then going, all right, now how I'm going to use my tools to get to that point in mixed reality.
I would say a few like tidbits, or don't put things too close to the user, because the visual quality of our display isn't optimized. It's optimized at like 1.5 meters, right? And so anything kind of like closer than like 0.75 meters, right? Am I saying the numbers right?
Things at 0.5, I mean, you know, things within your arm's reach feel good.
Yeah.
And things outside your arm's reach feel good. And there is a zone kind of in between there that doesn't feel as good.
Yeah, so avoid that.
In terms of vergence and accommodation mismatch. This is like not a word we use all the time now, but this, Paul Lacey mentioned, he's like, in the future, right, everyone will talk about VNA mismatch. It'll just be in our vernacular.
Yeah. So that's one tidbit. Try to avoid any kind of awkwardness with like field of view clipping by sizing and sort of distancing your content appropriately. There's some awesome examples in DevTools around, you know, ways to kind of make that more narrative. When using gestures, I think a lot of users don't have like a comfortable place to use gestures are around our chest and waist, and you know, but on our display you have to reach your hands up within the view frustum of the sensor, so it's a little unnatural. It roughly equals the visible sort of field of view of the display. So if you can put one-to-one feedback on the hand of what gesture and the key points or whatever you're using, the users will sort of know when the system is seeing their hands. Also, the users' arms are going to get tired, so their hands are going to kind of continuously want to fall down. So if you can sort of visualize when their hand starts to slip outside the view frustum of the display in some way, like a glow around the FOV or whatever, there's lots of ways you could do it. That's kind of what we recommend in the design guidelines, but you guys can come up with better ways. I think that's great. And another sort of, this isn't maybe a best practice, but something I'm excited about that I want a best practice to be here is around how we treat content that kind of coexists, like what design strategies and motifs we can use to talk about co-located content. Like the VR community, the AR community has done this awesome job of developing like portals and like particle materialization, dematerialization effects as like beautiful motifs that they're using throughout the field to sort of like join volumes that maybe don't make sense together, to create volume where there isn't, to handle surfaces in a flexible way, to make things appear, disappear. So I think that co-located stuff is like another challenge to develop best practices around. It's something I'd love for you guys to kind of come up with.
Got one
Like
more for you?
over.
Oh, we
Yeah.
over. Oh,
Yeah.
I was just gonna say really quickly, as stuff comes in really close, if you're playing Dr. G, have a look at what we call an outline shader, and that means that as the content comes in, we maintain an outline of it at the near clip, and that lets you know that you've still got a thing in your hand and it's nice and clean, and you don't get the weird grossness of you've stuck your head in a model, which at one point when you stuck your head inside of like Lord Coxswain's head and his teeth were moving up close to your No. Outline shader.
Yeah. Okay.
Cool.
Well, thanks, y'all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
I
you,
hope
guys.
that you learned a little bit here. I hope that you see that we're not claiming to know it all. And I hope some of you will hang around and we can all sort of sit here on the front of the stage and talk a little bit more afterwards. So thank you very much for coming.
Thanks.
Thank you guys.